She's coming. Where's Mom? She's old and slow. Old and slow.
She's older than I'm anxious. Historic.
If you have your Bible, turn with me to Mark, the 4th chapter. We'll be looking at the 35th and 41st verse in this. The song that you had just sang is I Will Rescue You. And it's not a coincidence, but this morning we are looking at calming of the storms. We're going to look at a passage this morning. Is one that probably in our lives, the realization is this. Jesus and his disciples were literally on the sea, and a mighty storm came up. And, this storm, as we look at it, we can kind of look at it into our life because, some of us sitting here today, you're in one or three phases. You've either just came through a storm, or you're in a storm, or you're about to be in a storm. All of us in our lives have been through storms, and we can relate to we were in the middle of that storm. We thought, there's just absolutely no way that I can ever get out of where I'm at right now. But the realization that if you're past the storm, then you can look back through it and just in a moment realize how Jesus brought you through that. So if you'll look with me at Mark, the 4th chapter, starting with that 35th verse. It says, on the same day when the evening had come, he said to them, let us cross over to the other side. Now when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat, and he was as he was, and the other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, and so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, Who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him? What we have to realize is this. As I said earlier, all of us at times are storm tossed. There are all of us at times, and the realization that life will be going along, and then all of a sudden, out of a blue, here comes a storm. We look at this, and there's several things that we're going to look at this morning as we look at these disciples. The very first thing that we see is this. It said there arose a very great storm. The amazing thing about it, there's not a doubt in any of our minds, and as we know that Jesus could have prevented this storm. He could have just got in the boat because he had got in the back. He was weary, and after dealing with all these multitudes, and it says the place that he went to the stern, and he was asleep on the pillow. Now, Jesus could have made this a very calm, uneventful day. Got a doubt in my mind about that. He could have laid back there on that pillow, and he could have slept all the way across the sea. Not a doubt in my mind. He could have stopped it. But let us remember that the disciples were led into the storm by following their master. They followed Jesus right into this storm. Some believe that storms come for Christians only when they rebel or disobey God, but that's not true. God's will isn't always smooth sailing. What we have to realize is this, that if we are a child of God, we will experience this. We're not immune from it. And we're going to look at these storms. This is the kind of storm that is not out of the ordinary on the Sea of Galilee. It's really more because if you study the Sea of Galilee, you'll realize it is just a great big lake. It's 13 miles long and 8 miles wide. It's surrounded by mountains and hills. The cool air comes over the mountains, and mixes with the warm air up from the sea. And violent storms can erupt without warning. And that's just how storms come in our life, isn't it? The phone rings, and just seconds, your life is changed forever. You have a routine doctor visit that's just a simple checkup. Your life changes forever. The realization is this: it can happen just as we go through, just easily driving your car, driving along, start going through an intersection, and bam, your life is changed forever. Your boss calls in the office. There's a storm that happens. But also, storms come for a variety of causes. For example, sometimes we blow up our own storms. These storms are out of our own making. Like there's a young man we read about in the Old Testament by the name of Jonah. You know, he decided not to do what God told him to. And it was amazing that as you read the story, how many times it says Jonah went down. Now, after he decided to go his own way, it says that he went down to Tarshish, down into the heart of the ship, down into the sea, and then he ended up down in the belly of a whale. Now, this storm was brought on by Jonah himself through disobedience. We always have to remember that. And after he decided to go his own way, and what we have to realize is once we decide to not to follow God and to go our own way, that's the direction that we are going to head in, is down. But you know, the realization, as I said, this storm was brought on by Jonah himself, by his stubborn will. And he holds the distinction of being the very first man that has ever spent the night in the belly of a whale. He was. But in the end, what we have to realize is this, that Jonah, as he was spiraling down, that once God got his attention, he started on the way back up. Some storms God creates himself, such as in John the 6th chapter, after he fed the 5,000 people. You remember that story? And then how he was tempted. The disciples must have been given to the popular pressure, because what happened? You know, the people there that he fed wanted to make him a king. You know, can you imagine the disciples around him as all this pressure started going on? And, you know, the popularity that they must have gained and how they loved the excitement of that, because after all that had went on. But Jesus said no. They got in the boat and go into Capernaum. And along the way, they again ran directly into the middle of another storm. Why? Because I believe he did that to divert the attention away from something that would have concealed a bigger problem in their lives. You know, sometimes God sends us a little storm to keep us from heading into a bigger one. Now, the story goes of a little boy who was playing with his sailboat at the edge of the lake. It got away from him and he couldn't reach it. He didn't want to lose it. So he came up with this bright idea that he picked up. He started picking up rocks and he was tossing them on the other side of the boat. And he kept doing this, and that way the waves and the ripples of the water would bring the boat closer to him. And eventually, he could reach it. You know, sometimes when we get away from God, he does the exact same thing. He causes little ripples on the other side of us to gently bring us back to him. And think about this. Some storms are caused by the devil himself. Sometimes Satan kicks up a storm in our life to try to get us off track. On one occasion, the Apostle Paul said, "I would have come to you, but Satan hindered me." You know, we have to understand that most of these disciples were raised on this sea and had fished it for years. They had no doubt been through countless storms. But in this case, all they thought about was that they were going to perish. In our lives, we can be just like these disciples. We can be so used to this calamity and so used to all this stuff goes around, and then all of a sudden something happens. And in our mind, it's a storm. There's no doubt, as many times as these disciples have been on this water, they've been through turbulence, they've been through winds, they've been through these waves, then all of a sudden, they just lose all train of thought. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? Have we forgot who is asleep in the back of the boat? And we have to understand this, because we have to realize that everybody has storms. Matthew, the 5th chapter, the 45th verse, causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Just because you are a believer in God doesn't mean you won't have storms. There's not a one of us here today that is exempt from this. But what we have to realize is this: God's purpose in the storm is for two things. One, for God's glory, to show his power, and for the disciples, the building up of their faith. John the 11th chapter, the 14th and the 15th verse says, "Then said Jesus unto them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am going for your sakes, that I am not there to be the intent ye may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him." You remember that story of Lazarus? What Lazarus' sisters had said? "Lord, if you'd have been here, he wouldn't have perished." Jesus went to the grave. What'd they say? "Lord, he's been 4 days dead. He's stinking." They blamed Jesus for what had taken place. Jesus was there to make a point. When Jesus called Lazarus, what happened? Lazarus came forward. But the storm that Mary and Martha was going through. Lazarus was sick. And they wanted Jesus to come at their time. Jesus don't always come at our time. And we have to realize that what was taking place, Jesus was teaching his disciples about this storm. And what we have to realize, and, that's what I always said, when we read our Bible, we look and we think, man, those disciples ought to know better than that, shouldn't they? But what we fail to realize is we're reading a story many, many years later. You just remember in time when we are in the middle of that storm in real life. It's a bad storm. Now, somebody could look at your life a couple hundred years from now and think, ain't no big deal. Because why? Because they see the other end of it. They're seeing the bigger picture of it. But the thing is, in your life right here, right now, we're just like, Lord, there's absolutely no way I can get out of this. But Jesus was teaching his disciples. He didn't use chalkboards and books. He used real life experiences to challenge their faith as he's doing to us. And the amazing thing about this is he is revealing himself to them in new and greater ways. And he's wanting to do the same thing with us. The second thing that we see is this: Christ was asleep during the storm. This is the only time we find Jesus asleep, and it's in a storm. Several other times we find the disciples sleeping, when Jesus has an important business. But this time he's asleep when they're biting their nails to the quick. And I can't help but wonder as I read this. Because the disciples are all up in the air, wanting Jesus to be there. Jesus is asleep when they really need him. Well, not just a short period of time from here. Jesus asked them, come pray with me for a little while. And Jesus comes back and the disciples are what? They're asleep. And as I think about that, I always think, how many times are we guilty of the exact same thing? We want Jesus to be there for us and be at our whim or beck and call. We want Jesus to be there for whatever reason we want him to be there. But we want Jesus to focus solely on us, on our time. But when the thing comes for him, when he asks us to do something, when he asks us to do something for somebody on his account, we're like, I'll just do that tomorrow. I really don't have time to do that today. Sometimes it seems like he's asleep, isn't it? We were in a storm in life and it seems like God was sleeping. And we ask the question, where are you, Lord? When I go through a storm, I feel like I have it all figured out. And then I know what the Lord ought to do, how he ought to do it, and when he ought to do it. But that leads me to two hard lessons that I have to keep reminding myself. Number one is this: God doesn't need my advice. And so many times, as I offer it to him and say, God, this is just what I think you ought to do here. And the second thing is this: God doesn't work on my timetable. And that's hard because, when we think about what we want, when we want it now. We live in a society, and you've heard me say so many times, we live in a disposable society. We used to go in and sit down at restaurants, but that one, then we changed from them to fast foods, and that wasn't fast enough. So let's knock a hole in the wall, and you tell them what you want on this side and drive right around on that side and get it, where you don't have to get out and go in. I can remember as a kid, there wasn't no fast food restaurants. Yeah, that was a long time ago. I can actually remember growing up, we would go visit my mother's sister in Mississippi. And Saturday, you had to make sure the car was filled up. Sack lunches were packed because there was no place to get gas on Sundays. Nobody was open. I can remember that very well. I don't know how we ever managed, how we survived through that. Looking at what we do now. But anyway, look at that. We think God needs to be on our timetable. But you remember Lazarus? He was sick, but yet it's still 2 more days before Jesus got there. You could look at that whole story of Lazarus and you could kind of translate it like this. Well, look who finally has decided to show up. Hope it isn't too much of an inconvenience for you, Lord. It might interest you to know that he's dead now. But that wasn't how it was it? So many times we are guilty of that. We're in the midst of that storm. And I tell you, in the midst of storms, our prayer life increases, doesn't it? Because we are so focused. We talk to God all the time then. And then we realize that he was there all along. I wonder maybe sometimes he gives us those storms so we'll actually come to him. Number 3 is this: the disciples' reaction to the storm. Now we look at the disciples and we see the very first thing. They cried out to Jesus. The realization our first impact most of the time when we come to the storm is this. We'll run to a friend, run to the nearest exit, or the thing is this, we'll run to where we think somebody is going to help us. And what happens, the storm will still be there when we get back, but we see the disciples went to Jesus first, as should we. And their character is revealed in the storm. The storms of life will either draw us closer to the Lord or it will push us further away. There is a lot of people in this world right now that haven't been to God in years and years and years because there was something that came up in their life and they blamed God for it. Whether they lost a loved one or no matter what, but they blamed God for it. And they ran away from him. What we realize is they responded in fear instead of faith. What the realization, fear is looking at God through our circumstances. We look at where we're at when things aren't going right, and we look and that's all we can see is what's going on around us. But what we realize, faith is looking at our circumstances through God. What we have to realize is that everything happens for a reason. Everything happens in its own time. And what we realize here is there's 3 reasons they shouldn't have mingled fear with faith. Number 1 is this. They had a promise from Jesus that they were going to make it to the other side. We fail to realize that. Because what took place, Jesus said, let us cross over to the other side. Jesus didn't say, let's get in the boat and see what happens, did he? So many times that when we look at God's promises, that we have to realize that he won't ask us to do anything that we can't accomplish. He didn't promise us a storm-free, easy life, but he did guarantee our success. Faith is just trusting in the promises of God. Number 2 is this. The Lord himself was in the boat with him. If you go back and study that day, you'll find out that very day they had seen him cleanse the leper. That very day they seen him heal countless of others. That very day they seen him cast out demons. And that very day. But what we fail to realize is this. Even after we see God do all those miraculously things that we happen, and we fall into a storm, then all of a sudden we seem to have lost all sense of reality, don't we? We think that he might have done all of that, but this is different. We have to realize he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. If he did it yesterday, he'll do it again today. And number 3 is this. They could see that the Lord himself was at perfect peace. Don't that just burn you up? You're going through the most horrific storm in your life, and you just look around and everybody else is just happy-go-lucky. And there it's not affecting them a bit whatsoever. When I suffer, I want everybody else to suffer. I tell them at work, if I'm on vacation, I want them to be working. It makes me feel a whole lot better. We have that mindset, don't we? When we have a situation, we see someone around us that's calm, we think, why does it not bother you too? We see God in the back. He's not wringing his hands in despair, wondering what's next. We realize he's in full control. He is asleep in the back of the boat and they wake him up. Now, do you think that Jesus was going to let this storm wipe them out? No. The disciples should have had enough faith in him to know that that wasn't going to happen either. The last thing that we look at is this. The quieting of the storm. See, the very first thing, Jesus rebuked the winds and the waves. In that 37th verse, as he said those Little words, peace, be still. Or that 39th verse, excuse me. Peace, be still, and the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He calmed that storm. He doesn't always do this. Sometimes he calms us in the midst of that storm. The problem that day was not the storm, the sinking ship, or the Savior sleeping in the back. It was the unbelief in the hearts of the disciples. How do we know that? Because Jesus asked them these words, "Why are ye fearful?" He questioned his disciples' lacks of faith. Jesus said, "Why are you so afraid? Why do you have no faith?" The realization that it challenges us. There is a verse that was wrote hundreds of years before. That verse was in Psalms 107:29. It tells us these words. It says, "He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed." Remember that verse, the next storm you come into. There's a story. We wonder how God works in mysterious ways. There was a mother in an African nation who came to Christ and grew in her commitment and her devotion to the Lord. And as so often, however, this alienated her from her husband. And over the years, he grew to despise and hate her new devotion to Christ. His anger and bitterness reached a climax when he decided to kill his wife, their two children, and himself. Unable to live in such a self-inflicted misery, but he needed a motive. So he decided he would accuse her of stealing his precious keys. The keys were to the bank, the house, and their car. Early one afternoon, he left his bank and headed for the tavern. His route took him across a footbridge extended over the headwaters of the Nile River. He paused above the river and dropped the keys. He spent all afternoon in the bar trying to get up enough motivation. Said later that afternoon, his wife went to the fish market to buy the evening meal. She purchased a large Nile perch. As she was gutting the fish, to her astonishment, in its belly were her husband's keys. How had they gotten there? What were their circumstances? She didn't know, but she cleaned them and hung them up on the hook. Now, her husband, sufficiently drunk, the young banker, came home that night and pounded open the front door, shouting, "Woman, where are my keys?" Already in bed, she got up, picked them up off the hook in the bedroom, and handed them to her husband. When he saw the keys, by his own testimony, he immediately became sober and was instantly converted. He fell on his knees, sobbing and asking for forgiveness, and confessed Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Now, this illustration came from Billy Graham. Do I know if it's true or not? I don't know. But if Billy Graham said it, I'm thinking there's a little bit of truth to it. But what we realize this in closing, as I started off, and as we sit here today, we realize this. We're in one of these places. We've either just came through a storm, in the middle of a storm, or about to go into a storm. We've all been there. Sometimes we seem to be in a storm more than we're out of a storm. But what we have to realize is this. Maybe you've prayed and got no answer. Maybe you think God is just asleep and not paying attention. But let me assure you, he's not. Did you know that you're not alone? but that Jesus is with you no matter what the problem. He's not asleep. He knows exactly where you're at, and he knows exactly what's going on. We just have to pray and to believe that God is going to make our storm not go away, but bring us through it. I'm going to ask as we stand, as Dottie and Doris come this morning,